What exactly constitutes a hate crime? We don't seem to have a consistent answer. The definition of a hate crime is simply a prejudice-motivated crime, typically involving violence. Now, that's pretty vague, and it leaves a lot of room for interpretation. Unfortunately, the term is not evenly applied. There's a troubling trend that the hate crime label is being used as a political weapon. I have 3 examples for you in this video. First, just a few weeks ago, far-left Muslim activist Linda Sarsour took to social media to condemn a supposed hate crime. Sarsour posted this message: "We must stand united against hate. Please support Rama, who was brutally beaten in an alleged hate crime in Columbus, Ohio." She also included these photos of a battered Somali American woman. Now, for those not familiar with Linda Sarsour, Sarsour is a Palestinian-American activist who openly defends Sharia law, even in America, and recently became the face of the leftist feminist movement as well as the Women's March. I once tried to ask her a question in my capacity as a journalist, and she promptly blocked me on Twitter. How professional. All I wanted to know was if she stood by some of her controversial and now infamous tweets, where she proudly defends Sharia law, where she whitewashes the treatment of women in Saudi Arabia, and where she viciously attacks activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Well, for this time around, I asked her if she wanted to comment in this story, and she's once again ignored me. Anyway, Linda Sarsour started a fundraising campaign for the victim of this alleged hate crime. And that campaign has already raised over $112,000. Now, normally raising funds for a victim is very good news. It's excellent to get people to help out in a cause. But it turns out in this instance, it was all under a false pretense. Sarsour claiming that this was a hate crime is nothing more than fake news. The police report out of Columbus, Ohio paints a much different, much more complicated picture. This was more of a case of domestic abuse that led to a brawl between neighbors than anything else. According to another victim in this fight, the alleged hate crime victim, the Somali American woman, she started it all by shouting at her 12-year-old son in the common area of an apartment building and allegedly beating him with a shoe. Now, the other woman, Samantha Morales, who happens to be of Mexican heritage, she came out to try to de-escalate the situation. Instead, she claims she was threatened and then she was jumped by 4 to 5 men, as well as several women, including the Somali American woman. She claims she was struck with a taser. Well, Morales' boyfriend, a man named Ricky Boyce, who's a white male, saw this happening through his apartment window and came out to try to protect his girlfriend. He used force to save her, and he claims that he didn't intentionally target or hit the other woman involved. Regardless, both women ended up in hospital with injuries. Sarsour teamed up with CARE, which is the Muslim Brotherhood Associated Group, and they raised money for the Somali Muslim victim, while totally ignoring the other victim in this case, who was also in hospital and also had a large medical bill. And to make matters worse, Sarsour and company race-baited the issue by highlighting the fact that it was a white man that was involved and spreading fake news that this was an anti-Muslim hate crime. There is no evidence whatsoever that this was a hate crime. Now, moving on to my second example. In France, there is evidence that a real hate crime was committed and then covered up by the authorities and the media. As reported by Joshua Yasmeh in the Daily Wire, an elderly Jewish woman was murdered, allegedly thrown from the balcony of her apartment building by her Muslim neighbor. The man reportedly called her Satan, and then he savagely beat her before throwing her to her death while shouting, you guessed it, Allah Akbar. According to a story in the Jerusalem Post, the 27-year-old Muslim man had previously called the 65-year-old victim's daughter a dirty Jew. All evidence points to anti-Semitism, Islamist supremacy, and prejudice as the motive here. And yet, French authorities have downplayed the incident, and they've refused to label this a hate crime. It sure looks like a hate crime to me. Now, our final example, number 3, something in Canada. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's top aide, his best friend and principal secretary Gerald Butts, took to Twitter to post this message. He wrote, "What was going on in 2015 again? police reported hate crimes targeting Muslim Canadians increased 61% from 2014 to 2015. And then he provided a link to a Statistics Canada report. The report states that hate crimes against Muslims, which were investigated by the police and found to have been motivated by hatred, rose from 99 incidents in 2014 up to 159 incidents in 2015. So in a country with some 36 million people, there were 159 instances of so-called hate crimes against Muslims. That's hardly a rampant problem. It's unfortunate, but it's hardly a rampant problem. The StatsCan report also notes that hate crimes against the Jewish population were the highest in Canada, with 178 incidents. Of course, Trudeau's sidekick didn't mention the hate crimes against Jews. That's because he too was race baiting. He was trying to suggest that conservatives were to blame for violence against Muslims. Of course, there's no evidence whatsoever that conservatives have anything to do with violence against Muslims. But to answer Gerald Butts' question of what else was going on in 2015, well, ISIS terrorists were broadcasting gruesome videos. They were beheading journalists, torturing Christians, committing genocide and mass rape against Yazidis, all in pursuit of their Islamist caliphate. Meanwhile, Islamic State jihadists were boasting about sending terrorist agents into Europe alongside Syrian refugees. And then we saw subsequent murderous rampages in Brussels, Paris, and then cities across Europe. Also in 2015, Canadians were still dealing with the 2 Islamist terrorist attacks on Canadian soil in late 2014, where jihadists murdered 2 members of the Canadian forces. Yeah, it was a pretty violent time for Islamist-inspired killings worldwide. It's unfortunate, but perhaps a consequence of this global jihadist insurgency and the violence carried out in the name of Islam may have led to an additional 60 or so crimes against Muslims in Canada, many of which were property crimes. Or so the numbers say. But honestly, given the lackluster and inconsistent use of the term, and given the way that hacks like Gerald Butts and Linda Sarsour have politicized this term, I don't give these numbers much weight at all. For the Rebel Media, I'm Candace Malcolm.